Welcome to Higher Edification, a podcast featuring college presidents and other leaders talking about the state of higher education as well as the challenges and opportunities we face. Higher Edification is a production of ACUP, the Association of Independent Colleges and Universities of Pennsylvania and Misericordia. I'm one of your hosts, Dan Myers, president of Misericordia University in Dallas, Pennsylvania, and my co-host is Tom Foley, who is the president of ACUP. And we are delighted today to welcome our guest, Mary Dana Hinton, who is the president of Hollins University. Welcome, Mary. Great to be with you today.
Hi, Dan. Hello, Tom. It's truly an honor to be with both of you.
Thanks, Mary. It's so sweet of you to be with us. Mary, we're going to try to do three things, but we're going to really let you drive this. And if it goes in other directions, that's just fine. But the things that Dan and I talked about are, one, love to hear a little bit about your trajectory, your journey. And we know that that leads directly into the second thing we want to talk about, which is leading at the margins, your book and your story and the relevance of that story today. And then if we have time, and hopefully we get a little bit of time to just get your reflections on the current state of affairs in higher education, culture wars, and everything else that's going on. So we'll see how we do with that. Let me just start off, Mary, and I'm only have, really one question. I know some of your story. I'd love you to share that story with our audience.
Absolutely. Well, thank you again, Tom and Dan, for this opportunity. And I'm happy to tell my story. And I actually think I'll start with my professional story, which involves Misericordia University. When I got out of undergrad, I knew I wanted to be in a role where I served others. And in my mind then, and even today, the height of service is teaching. And so I began my career as an elementary school teacher. What I wasn't aware of then, that I've become very aware of now, is that you also have to have the talent to do the job that you want to do. And I was not a great elementary school teacher. And I share that because if a young person is listening to this, it's important to know you may not be good at everything. I loved the kids, but the stakes felt very high to me. You're either helping a young kid learn to love learning or you're not. And at that point in my life, I didn't think I was helping. And so I went back to graduate school, got a master's degree in clinical child psychology, which aligns with my undergraduate degree, went into policy work, which I loved doing. I did a stint in corporate philanthropy. And then I began running a nonprofit, and that nonprofit focused on the K-12 sector. I opened 22 public schools over the course of several years and was really enjoying that work. So we've covered maybe the first half of my career, which was mostly in the nonprofit education space. I still always felt that desire to serve, and I still believe that teaching was the way to do it. I just knew that the elementary level wasn't for me. So keep that in mind. Mm-hmm. So I'm moving along in my career. I have a very young family, and I finally decide, and this was the first opportunity in my life that I was able to do this, I was going to go to school to study something just because I wanted to. And what I wanted to study was religion and education. So I went to Fordham University and initially was just taking a couple of classes at Fordham and fell in love with the program and decided to get my PhD. Now, I should note, I did not have a professional aspiration attached to this degree credential. I just wanted to do it. And at some point we can talk about why that was so meaningful to me, but I just wanted to get this degree. So I completed the program. And in my last couple of months in the program, I saw a position opening at Misericordia University. It was then College Misericordia. And it was for a 1-year appointment, half-time teaching. So I was going to teach in the religious studies program, 2 courses, and half-time what was then called the multicultural student advisor role. And I said to my board chair at the nonprofit I was running, Opening Schools, I said to him, it's just a 1-year appointment. I'll be back. I'm just going to take a little sabbatical. I want to try out this fancy new degree that I have. And I never went back. And I still feel guilty about that to this day. But I fell in love with higher education in ways that I never expected. I loved teaching in the classroom, but what made my Misericordia experience so rich was that I also had this phenomenal opportunity to learn and grow on the student affairs side of things. So in my experience, it was never an either or. There was never any sort of tension between the academic side of the house and the student affairs side of the house. I got to embrace both. And that has really guided my career since then. So I eventually took on a tenure track role in religious studies at Misericordia. I then was able to become the director of the core curriculum. So to all of you core curriculum directors, I say that is the fast track to the presidency. I did that and was eventually named Associate VP AA. I then left Misericordia and went to Mount St. Mary's College in Newburgh, New York, and as the VP for Strategic Planning, and eventually became the VP AA there. And then thanks to Father Kevin Mackin, who was the president I served under at the Mount, he really prepared me for presidency. He was such a generous and intentional sponsor. He gave me opportunities. He helped me go to fundraising school. He sent me to Harvard's IEM program. He was not just a mentor, he was truly a sponsor. And he brought me the job position for the College of St. Benedict and insisted I apply for it. And I did. And that's how I became a college president. I often tell people I was a reluctant college president. It's not something I aspired to. My mission in life was not to be a college president. And it's still not. I love it. I love the job. I love the difficulty of the job. But my mission in life is focused on crafting educational equity.
Mhm.
And that's what this position allows me to do. And I'm grateful for that opportunity.
Mhm.
Before we go back to Dan, who's going to lead us into a conversation about the book, Mary, I love the notion of the reluctant college president. I often describe myself as a recovering college president. So I'm going to add that to the litany. But that's not at all where you started, Mary. And could you say a word about your early trajectory? And I know that will lead us then into Dan's discussion with you about the book.
Absolutely. So that is, you did indeed, Tom, get the curated version of the journey. In some ways, my journey to this podcast today began in rural North Carolina. It began as the child of a woman who believed that only education can make a difference in your life. And what's so extraordinary about my mother's deep belief in that was the fact that she had only been allowed to go through 8th grade in school herself. My mother was born in 1926 in rural North Carolina and had never had a birth certificate. Black births weren't systematically recorded when and where she was born. And she had just never had a lot of opportunities. And I'm sorry, I still get a bit emotional. I love my mom. And she worked so hard for her children to have an opportunity. So when I was in 9th grade or 10th grade, my mother told me, you need to go figure out how to get to college. So my sister, who's 5 years older than me, had done a wonderful program called the A Better Chance program, which takes low-income kids and sends them to private high school. So she was on a great trajectory. I've never been good at standardized tests, so I didn't score high enough to get into that program. But my mother told me I needed to go and figure out how to get to college. She would say, College is the only thing that's going to change your life, that's going to pull our family out of poverty, that's going to give you what you need to serve. So when I say that I graduated and went into teaching, it's because I'd been told my whole life that it's not enough to be smart, it's not enough to be educated, that you must deploy that education in the service of others. So I needed to find out how to go to college so that I could serve the world. And when I asked my guidance counselor at my school how to do that, she told me that Black women don't go to college and that I should just look at the military, which is a noble profession. I don't want there to be any mistake about that, but it wasn't what I wanted for myself. And I remember on the bus ride home that afternoon being afraid that I was going to have to tell my mother that I did not do what she told me to do, because I came home with no idea how to go to college. I just knew I was told it wasn't for me. So I explained it to my mother. And the next day she went to work. My mother was the housekeeper for a family called the Coopers. And she went to work and explained to them what had happened. And my mom was a very proud person who did not ask for help. That was not what she did. If you wanted something in life, my mother believed you worked for it. But she asked them to help me get an education, which I imagine was one of the hardest things for my mother to have to do. And Betty Cooper immediately said, we will send her to a private high school. And within a couple of weeks, I had been admitted to St. Mary's in Raleigh, North Carolina. And so my story began with two very different women, but two women who believed in my ability and who believed most of all in the power of education. And that is why I say to you today, my mission is not around my title. My mission is around educational equity, because how many kids are there who don't have a mom who says, you've got to go get an education, or who don't have a sponsor like Mrs. Cooper who says, I will pay for that for you. There's so many kids that I grew up with who were just as smart as I was, who didn't get the lucky break that I got. So what I wake up every morning determined to do is to create a system and a structure and a world where you don't need luck to get an education, where it is, in fact, your birthright. And I do this work because those two women did so much for me. And there are lots of other folks along the way who fit into that story. Tom, I don't know if you remember a conversation we had in a very small airport one day, but you encouraged me in a challenging moment as a president. And Laurie Hetherington, whom I mentioned already, encouraged me throughout my career. There's so many people, Father Kevin, and others who believed in my ability. And I now think my job is to believe in the ability of every student I encounter and to surround them with the hope and encouragement that I have been surrounded with throughout my life.
A lot of your story, Mary, is about, starting in the margins, so to speak. And your book is called Leading from the Margins. For those of you on the audio version, I'm holding up the book right now. It's called Leading from the Margins, College Leadership from Unexpected Places. And it's a great read. I highly recommend people pick this up. But I would just say, when you say from unexpected places, certainly your guidance counselor would have been very surprised to find out that you ended up being a college president, and that you started off in that position of being in the margins in some way. Could you say a little bit about what you mean by margins and how that shapes the lives of people, and why you're reaching to people in the margins now? As you just said, that's a big part of what you do, but maybe you could talk a little bit about what that means, that margins concept.
Yeah, happy to. So, on the one hand, we can define a margin, and I say this in the book, as a boundary or as a constraint. I choose not to see it that way. Tend to see the margins as a place of nurturance and hope and genesis. In my career, for a long time, I thought that I had to hide my marginal characteristics, that I'm a woman, that I grew up poor, that I'm Black, that I'm from the rural South. I thought that I needed to hide those parts of myself in order to be successful. I believed, as I think the central narrative is, that success comes from being in the center, that you have to be and act and look a certain way that the center has said as a leader. And it was really freeing for me one day when I realized that every strength I bring as a leader is because I come from the margins. And so I say to folks all the time, I'm not the leader I am despite being from the margins. I'm the leader I am because I am from the margins. It's because I know what it's like to be overlooked. I know what it's like to be told you're not enough. I know what it's like to lay awake in a dorm room and wonder, are they going to find out tomorrow that I can't afford to be here? I know what it's like to try to hide your Southern accent because you don't want to be ridiculed. All of those things shape my leadership today. So my hope is that other people who are in the margins today will realize that they too are being equipped for wonderful things, that they don't have to define themselves by the center, that in fact, they can travel to and through the center and reach other people on the margins. But I think it's also important for folks who are in the center to realize, hey, you can travel to the margins too. We can be allies together. That for higher ed to really thrive, we are all in this work together. I just want those emerging leaders who think they have to be something or someone other than who they authentically are. I want them to know that there's a leadership role and space for them, and that they are bringing extraordinary gifts and talents to that leadership role.
One thing you say in the book, which is I think obviously true in many ways, is that higher ed isn't configured properly to address the needs of people in the margins. And we could see that by just how many come to higher education and their rates of success at getting through. What do we need to do differently? It's the system, the configuration's not right somehow. What are some of the things that higher ed needs to do, or maybe even a bigger society or a government needs to do to make higher education work better for people that are coming from the quote unquote margins?
Yeah. I mean, there are many ways to answer that, Dan. One, I think we've got to be better partners with K-12. I mean, I spend a lot of time thinking about the pipeline, and I mean that it's starting with early childhood. Higher ed has something to offer. If young kids are not able to read, if they don't have books in their homes, how are they going to land in higher education? We have to be better partners. I think we need to be better partners to educators in K-12. How can our campuses become resources for the school districts we are a part of or are adjacent to? We have to help young kids see themselves on college campuses. That was one thing that was really hard. Right now, about 56% of students nationally in higher education are first-generation college students. How do we help them see themselves as college students much earlier than when they get that first postcard junior or senior year? How do we bring them to campus as middle schoolers? Hollins will have about 100 to 150 middle schoolers on campus on Thursday. We do these partnerships so kids can see that. I had not really seen a college campus until my sister graduated, the one who's 5 years older than me.
Mm.
To be in that space is really powerful. So how do we create those opportunities? Once students matriculate onto our campuses, How do we demystify what it takes to be successful in higher education? So when I went off to college, I thought, never go to office hours, never go to the tutoring center, never go to the quantitative reasoning center, because I brought a sense of shame with me. I thought if I go to those places, they will know I'm not smart enough to be here. I didn't, as a first gen college student, I didn't know that those are the first places I should have gone when I landed on campus. So I tell students in my first conversation with them in their first day on campus, if you do nothing else in this first week, go to office hours, go to the writing center, and go to the career center. But we don't tell students that. We assume they know that. We have to look at our curricula. How do we help students understand why a business class is informed by an ethics class, is made even richer by a literature class? We expect our students to come in and connect the dots when really that's our job to help them see. It's our job to help them see that if you're a nursing student, but you take an art history class, the research shows you're better with your patients because you learn how to gaze at a person or an object in a better way. It's our job to demystify that, but we oftentimes in the sector, we bring students in and we leave it to them to figure that out. And if you're a kid from the margins like I was, that's so opaque. I wasn't going to figure that out on my own. So I think higher ed has for a long time based its identity and its success on who we exclude. I think that was a point of pride. And what I'm calling on us to do is to base our success on who we include and how we can help more students, including those students from the margins, not only see themselves in higher education, but be successful in higher education.
I think you're so right about partnering more with K through 12, because by the time a student gets to us, or doesn't get to us,
Or doesn't,
I
right?
mean, they've lived a life,
That's
up
right.
to that point. And, sometimes we're really focused on retaining students through to graduation and making sure they succeed. Well, it's harder for some than others because they have lived a life up to that point.
That's right.
And if we could somehow have more impact on the earlier phases, when
That's
they
right.
get to us, they would have a chance to be more successful as they go through.
Right.
Um,
As supportive partners. I mean, K-12 doesn't need us coming in and telling them what to do. They need our partnership. They need us to be a resource for them. So I think you're exactly right. I do want to add, Dan, lately I've been playing with a notion of marginalized institutions. So I just want to run this by you because I do think the other challenge that we're facing in higher education is that there's a sense that if you're not in the top 25 institutions nationally, there's a question of our value. We are marginalized as institutions. And I want to make the argument that those institutions that find ourselves in the margins are the access institutions. We're the institutions that are taking a chance on young people. We're the institutions that are supporting communities. We're the institutions that are changing families' lives, the trajectories of communities. But because we're not on that top sort of list, we are overlooked. There's this interesting fact that Harvard, Yale, Princeton, and Columbia got more mentions in the New York Times and the Washington Post than all 1,043 community colleges combined. Think about that for a second. Think about how many millions of kids are served by those community colleges who get overlooked. And I wish all good things for Harvard, Yale, Princeton, Columbia, and the other 21 in that top 25. I want them to be successful. But we have been marginalized often as institutions. So how do we take a moment and say, this is what we bring, and what we bring to the sector has value. The students we serve have value. And how do we begin to think about what the margins have taught us as institutions that we can use to become better and serve our students better?
Yeah, I mean, and if we want higher education to serve more students and do a better job with those who are struggling, it's the schools that you're
That's
mentioning,
right.
and I will say, like ours,
Like
that
mine.
yeah, that are the ones that where that's happening. I mean,
That's right.
the kids that go to Harvard and Yale are not terribly at risk of failing, and you can see
You'll
that in
be
this.
okay.
Yeah, it's institutions like ours that will take a bigger risk in a sense,
Right.
and be figuring out how to deal with that. That's where the difference is really made in terms of people being successful or not with higher education. And so I get a little worked up when people want to use certain kinds of metrics
Right.
to rate these schools, because then you're sort of rewarding the privileged, and you're damaging those who are the ones that are doing the work on the edge where the
Right.
difference really is made, and
That's
that's where
exactly the
where
margins. We're doing
that's
the work in the margins. That's right.
that's right, where the institution becoming marginalized. That's very, very interesting way of thinking about that. Yeah. So
It's very interesting, Mary, that as you explain all of that, especially in the state that Dan and I are in right now, the schools that we work with, there's almost 90 independent nonprofit colleges. We're sort of counter the narrative, almost counterintuitive. It shocks people, but I know that you know this. In Pennsylvania, 47% of the low-income students, those getting Pell Grants, are in the independent nonprofit schools.
That's right.
54% of the underrepresented minorities are in the nonprofit schools. Of the 13 schools in Pennsylvania that have more than 50% Pell kids, 9 of them are independent nonprofits.
100%.
And, we still get hit with the narrative. I just did an op-ed piece trying to address this, that this is somehow elitist, when for us, it's all about trajectory. As Dan said, the key measurement is where'd you start from?
That's
Where'd
exactly
you
right.
end up? Not just where'd you end up, so it's fascinating to me, Mary, with your life experience and your professional experience, that you hit on exactly that, and which is so counter sort of the current, almost anti-higher ed attitude that's out there in state legislatures, and in whole parts of the country. So really appreciate your comments in that regard. That's the reality.
And that's our call as leaders right now in private, independent, nonprofit higher education. Our call, I think, is to help the public, the narrative, reshape itself to recognize that we are the access institutions today. Tom, what you described for Pennsylvania, I would describe for Virginia, where Hollins is located, for Minnesota, where the College of St. Benedict was located. I mean, the numbers aren't exactly the same, but the trends are. If you are a low-income student of color, first generation, you are more likely to be served at one of the private nonprofit institutions. You're more likely to graduate from one of our institutions. And I don't know if we haven't proclaimed it or if we are drowned out by this narrative that there are only, a handful of schools that merit consideration. Either way, our success is bound to looking at a young person, seeing not only their own articulated aspirations, but seeing the potential that young person brings into this space, to see their potential. And what we do is we journey with those kids, but we're journeying with their whole entire families. Sometimes I have to go see Nana, grandmas, to talk to them about why their student needs to do an internship. Or sometimes we see the rewards of our work. Match day was this past Friday. A student that I served back in 2016, who's just finished med school, did a Zoom of their match. I got to be there when they opened the letter. This is a kid who never took for granted that med school was going to be a thing, much less that they were going to get one of the top placements for their match. That's what we do. We aren't just turning out kids. I'm still in touch with some students I had in classes at Misericordia, because private nonprofit higher education is on a journey of transformation. At Hollins, our strategic plan vision is that we become a nation's leader in social, economic, and civic mobility. It's not about how much we can raise. It's not even about the number of students. It's about how we move students economically, socially, and civically. Our democracy depends on what we are doing in private, nonprofit higher education. And I think it's so important that our country understands that.
Yeah. A lot of work to do there, but good work. And I do agree with you that there's a lot of room for us to help people understand the experience at our schools more. One thing you do in your book quite a bit is, I would call it good advice for presidents and leaders, not just presidents, but leaders of all kinds. And I think a lot of it boils down to, if I may be so bold to paraphrase you, is having your personal authenticities, and I'll say that with an S, authenticities, match well with the institution's mission in its particular time and place. And that seems to be really key to being an effective leader, being an effective president. I wondered if you might talk a little bit about that, maybe an example or two from your own experience where that kind of resonance between those two things really worked to not only help you be successful in your role, but to push the institution forward in a good way.
Yeah. Thanks, Dan, for that question. I have been extraordinarily fortunate to have had that sort of deep alignment with the institutions I've served. And there's a chapter in the book that talks about ways you can create that alignment. So I won't get into that so much. I think it's maybe more interesting to hear about how you discern that alignment. So a lot of leadership is about discerning what fits with who you are as a human and who you aspire to become as a leader. And I learned those lessons, or I began learning those lessons, Dan, on the Misericordia campus. When I was at Misericordia, I reported to Sister Jean Massaro. She was then the vice president for student affairs. And Sister Jean taught me about the power of mission of an institution. So if you ask anyone, they'll tell you Mary Hinton's always talking about mission, and they're right. And I learned that sitting at the knee of Sister Jean Massaros. To this day, I know at Misericordia University, mercy, service, justice, and hospitality. I know that. I learned that. I can repeat the same for Mount St. Mary's College or Hollins University and the College of St. Benedict, all of those places. Because what I learned is if you are in a leadership role, you need to embody the mission, whether it's at a Catholic institution, an HBCU, a women's college, a secular institution, a land grant. You have to find resonance and alignment between that mission and who you are. Very early on in this conversation, I used the word vocation. If what you're doing is just a job, perhaps you don't need that alignment. But I think for leaders, leadership is a vocational call. I believe that you have to align that vocational call with the mission of the institution that you're serving. To me, that's so important. And I learned it on the Misericordia campus, and it has followed me. So in the book, a lot of the questions that I invite the reader to wrestle with are questions about what does matter to you? What is your personal mission, purpose, goal in this life? You have to be clear about that so that you can identify institutions where there is an alignment between your personal mission, vocation, purpose, and the institution you're serving. Because if there's not that alignment, then I don't think you've set yourself up for the type of success that will move you forward. And that's hard work. But as an executive coach told me once, the vast majority of leadership is managing yourself. And I believe that to be true. And I think in order to manage yourself, you have to know who you authentically are. And so I think that's so important for leaders Do you want to be at the place where you can live your true identities? And what will it take to be in that space? But that means, Dan and Tom, that you have to be vulnerable and share your true, authentic self with your community. And that's really hard. But if you're going to ask an institution to welcome you as you are, you have to show who you are. You have to take the time to discern that alignment. And I think that's really important for leaders to do.
You've given some examples, Mary, of doing that already in this conversation. I absolutely agree with you. That's a very hard thing to do. Can you say a little bit more about how you have found that way to share your authentic self on a college campus?
Yeah, I didn't start in that space as a leader. I remember my first day at the College of St. Benedict was June 16th, 2014. And I remember sitting at that desk and thinking, okay, so now what? I don't know if you all remember your first days as presidents, but there's this moment of, oh my God, what do I do? And so you look around and you look at leaders that you admire and you think, I'll try to do what they're doing. But shortly after I started as a leader, I had the great privilege of spending some time with Earl Lewis. He was then the president at the Mellon Foundation. And I said to Earl, I'm finding that a lot of my experiences are shaped by my childhood in the margins, by my own experiences at college and in graduate school. And I said, am I supposed to box that out? Or do I let that in? And he said, that's who shaped you. That's who made you. Those experiences are what will make you a leader. So I think I needed permission to allow myself to share my identities and my experiences and to tell my story. A story I had packed away. You don't go to Williams and lead with poverty and a sense of shame. That's not what I did. So once I had that permission to share who I am, I think it granted other people permission to share who they are. I think people now at the institutions I've served know that I'm going to welcome them as they are, that we're going to learn together, that I'm going to tell you when I don't know something, that I'm going to share when I'm having difficulty, and I'm going to create a space where you can share when you're having difficulty. But I had to grow into that. And that's part of the reason why I want to tell other people now that it's okay, because I needed that permission to be my authentic self. And I want to grant that to others because we are all bringing something to this enterprise that's sacred and valuable and worthy. And unless we feel free to unleash that, we won't be able to live into our full leadership potential.
Well, you make a great case in the book too, that those vulnerabilities, they bring great strength to us because, from among other reasons, it allows us to have empathy for
That's right.
other people who have marginalized experiences as well. And that's very powerful in achieving what it is we're really trying to do in this educational environment. So
Thank you.
I think that's very powerful. So we've been talking with Mary Dana Hinton, and her new book is out, and it's called Leading from the Margins, College Leadership from Unexpected Places. And I encourage you all to pick that up as soon as you can. It's a great read, and I know that you'll enjoy it very, very much. Thank you for joining us today. We've been speaking with Mary Hinton, president of Hollins University in Virginia. We hope you enjoyed this installment of Higher Edification, brought to you by the Association of Independent Colleges and Universities of Pennsylvania and Misericordia University. Tom and I will look forward to seeing you next time. Tune in again for another episode of Higher Edification.